On the plus side, at least we weren't streaming that.
Yes! This is like the small benefits in life.
Small wins. Small wins. Also, on the plus, well, we could see this, like, I could see what was going on when I messaged you. Len only has the active talker on, so that probably won't hit the live stream.
Oh, that's good.
I'm like, I should maybe give her that
I didn't have it up on my screen, and I've had my video off like 90% of the time, so it just absent brain, whatever.
Yep. I'm just like, I look like absolute like shit, so I've just been like,
yeah,
on my bed. My cat's like in between me and the computer. Oh, thanks, Len.
So yelling at us, telling us as oh, cool. I guess I should start my class, and whoever wants to can be watching live or watch the recording. Suppose that's the thing.
I don't even know what class we're on.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna give my little spiel, and you can find out.
Cool.
This is Beginner Embroidery with Journeyman Laeta. This class will run an hour. At the end of that hour, we will retire to the Discord after class discussion channel if we need to. So yeah, beginner embroidery, I have to embroider on my lap so that you can see. So I'm going to move my video down so that you can see my embroidery. What this does mean is I won't be able to see the chat function. So if you have questions, please just shout it out loud and I will be able to answer it. Before I start, I already am pre-mounted to save time. And when you're mounting your embroidery, you want to make sure that the tension of your, my brain's leaving me, of whatever this is called, your embroidery hoop, the interior tension, you want to make sure is very consistent throughout. It should feel like a trampoline. So it should give you a tiny bit of give when you tap on it, and then completely release and go back to nice and taut once you lift your hand off. The other thing, I'm using a metal hoop right now, but if you're using a wooden hoop like you can usually buy, I always wrap my interior hoop with fabric tape, or you can just use plain ordinary fabric, and it helps give extra things. Brain has been functioning too much today. Resistance against the fabric to keep it from slipping once you've mounted it in the hoop. So I highly recommend doing that if you're using a basic wooden embroidery hoop, which is what I use most of the time. The design I etched out on my hoop is just a cute little daisy flower. I wanted to choose something that would be simple and fast because hand embroidery, prep yourself, takes a really long time. So I chose something small in the hopes I might be able to do it in an hour, but also show you some variety of stitches. So I already got out my embroidery floss. Embroidery floss is different from basic sewing thread. It's thicker, and the floss that I like to use comes with 6 strands. Usually I will take those 6 strands and I will divide them into 3. And this just provides a slightly smoother, thinner finished embroidery as opposed to the solid 6. The exception to this is if I am doing letters of any kind. I almost always maintain my 6 strands for lettering, but everything else I split it into strands of 3. And next I thread my needle. Embroidery needles have a bigger hole than basic hand sewing needles so that you can fit the thicker thread in there. If I can do it. There we go. There we go. Sweet. So you always want to leave one tail longer than the other, and then knot the long tail. And then I'm just doing a slip knot, wrapping it around one of my fingers, and tying it taut right there. Now I have my lovely dandy thread on my needle, and it's all ready to begin. So the first stitch we're going to go over is a basic back stitch. So it begins by putting the starting from the back side of your fabric. You're going to pull your thread through and do a single stitch width. Pick the size of width you want to keep consistent for the rest of your embroideries. So the big thing with embroidery is consistency. The width of your stitch should be the same throughout your project unless you switch out stitches. So I've done one stitch. And then for a back stitch, I move it forward one stitch length. So I'm coming up in front of that single stitch. And then I pull it taut on the bottom. And then I go in the same hole of my previous stitch. And I pull it flat. And then for my next stitch, I go forward one stitch length from the previous stitch ended. Pull. And then back stitch or go backwards into that previous hole. Pull. So I'm making sure I'm keeping those stitch lengths consistent. One stitch forward, back, pull. When I'm doing it, I don't want to pull super duper tight on my stitch like this, or it'll bunch up my fabric and it won't lay flat. So I want to make sure that both my stitch length is consistent and my stitch tension is consistent. On the reverse side, I don't want to keep my thread super duper loose like this. There's a cute little hole right now. I don't want that. There was one specific stitch you want that for, which I will be showing you later on. But 98% of the stitches, you want to keep it nice and flush to the side of your embroidery fabric. So I'm just going along and going one stitch forward, then back to that previous hole and down. One stitch forward, back to the previous hole and down. And now I have come to that circle, so I'm just going to do the same thing, a stitch forward along the circle and then back down to that previous section. A stitch forward, back down. Being sure to be accurate with where I'm hitting that that back stitch and where I'm placing it when I'm going in front of my other stitch. I'm glad I chose a tiny design so that you don't have to watch me backstitch all by myself. So like I mentioned, embroidery takes forever. So my favorite thing to do when I'm embroidering is I bring it to all my D&D sessions. And while I'm doing that session for the evening, I have my embroidery on the table / in my lap, and I'm embroidering away. And I use it as a fidget. In education, we have a thing called a fidget. And a fidget is anything that keeps your hand busy and your brain free. It helps focus your attention on where it needs to be. So I quickly came to the realization that embroidery was an excellent fidget for me. At this point, my last stitch was right here, and I want my next stitch to be right here. So rather than crossing over my fabric, my stitches like that, which would lead to a messy back, I'm going to weave my needle through the back of my previous stitches. And this will both secure that last stitch I've done and make for a nice, neat back for my next stitch. And then I'm ready to start back up on the other side. So that's something I've learned or have been taught that helps make your embroidery just look a lot neater, is making sure. And I am using a variegated thread because I don't have a lot of it. So the only thing I can use it on is tiny pieces. So I figured now is a good time to use it. I had a thought. This is a back stitch. Oh yeah, so I use embroidery as a fidget during my gaming groups so that I'm paying attention to what's happening in the session and not on my phone looking at Facebook or anything. So that's the fun thing about fidgets. Lots of people have lots of different fidgets. Some people can use something as a fidget, and for someone else, it might be a toy. So a good example in the classroom is your student who doodles. Some students who doodle because it helps keep their hands busy, but their mind free. But if you have a student who doodles and is not paying attention, they are not using it as a fidget, they are using it as a toy, in my personal, not necessarily a toy, but that's what I tell my students. In my opinion. So that student would not be allowed to draw while others might be because they know how to use it appropriately. That comes down to knowing your students. Gotta know your students.
It's why there are so many different types of fidgets. I just finished a classroom order, and I ordered like 15 different types of fidgets because everyone fidgets differently.
So true. Some cheap fidgets I learned about in my how to teach the exceptional child class were things like paper clips, where the student can manipulate that little piece of metal into whatever shape they want. Rubber bands, where they can have that resistance to touch and hold on to. Play-Doh makes for a great fidget for some students, but again, for other students, it becomes a toy.
Plastic bendy straws.
Bendy straws. Even that's why a lot of students will click their pins in class, is because they're using it as a fidget. It can also be an annoyance for other students, but if you realize they're looking for that resistance, then you can find a quieter fidget for them to use. I know one technique a teacher was telling me that they used for fidgets is they had an open fidget box. And students could go and grab the fidgets if they need to, and she could always take them away. That was a deal she made with the students. And what she found is like the first week or so, it was there. Almost every student would take one because it was cool. But as it became a normalcy, only the students who actually needed the fidget would take the fidget. So that's a cool thing. I don't know how many of you are gonna end up who are watching this or will be watching this in the future will end up with students or children in your future. But it's a nice thing to know that sometimes if someone's doing something and it doesn't look like they're paying attention, they might be, and they're just using it as a way to keep their brain focused. Adults fidget too. And if we don't fidget, sometimes we just check out of what's happening and we stop paying attention in life. So it goes both ways.
I have a fidget cube. It's like a 6-sided thing, and it does a bunch of different stuff. And it's got one that's like it makes that click, like the pressure of clicking a pen, but it doesn't actually make any sound. Which I quite like. But it's got the same like feeling of clicking a pen.
Nice. I've seen fidget cubes. I haven't used any of them. I've used one myself, but it didn't really do anything for me as far as fidgets go. Alright, I'm getting to the end of my thread, so I'm going to show you all how to tie off your thread. So you're going to tie off your thread on the back side, and then what I do is I loop it through a previous stitch, and then I go back in the loop-de-loop I made when I was going into that stitch, and I pull it tight. And then I do that a couple times. This is one way. This is the first way I learned how to finish a thread. There's a fancier way that if I ever teach a fancy embroidery class, I will show you. So I'm just making a couple loops and then tying a knot. It's like making a slip knot, except you're not using your fingers. And then we're ready for our next piece of thread, which I need to figure out what end I need to knot so it matches with my variegated. Threading needles. I'm usually really good at this. But of course, not when I have a class and a timer and being recorded. Never then. There we go. Nice and threaded. So again, I'm just going to start from the bottom and you begin your backs. I guess now that I've begun it, I do 1 stitch length away, pull tight, go back 1 stitch length. But anyways, yeah, I use embroidery as my fidget. I'll even take it when I go to church. I'll take it with me into church service. And if anyone yells at me about it, I kind of look at them and I'm like, do you want me to pay attention to the pastor or not? And no one's ever given me crap about it when I look at them and say that to them. So I think it works just fine. Anyway, so you're doing a backstitch. I like backstitch for outlining things. If I don't want as solid as an outline as this, you can do a running stitch, which is a stitch I'll be showing you in a little bit, assuming we don't run out of time. And I'm trying to backstitch as quickly as I can while still doing a semi-decent job. But it makes for a nice outline, and it makes for just a decent decorative stitch in its own right. It's not the one I would normally do if I'm looking for a decorative stitch, but it's not bad. For sure, not bad. One trick I have is if I'm looking at the front side and I need to remember where my thread is I just pull it a little bit, and where it divots, I know is where the end of my thread is. That way I don't cross all the way across my design. Always etch out your design before you begin embroidery. I usually use chalk to begin with. That way I can easily change it. And then if I'm doing a light colored design, I often have to then go over it with a pencil. Be careful because pencil doesn't erase very nicely on fabric, but chalk will dust itself off of your design if you because when you're going up and down with your needle, you're creating a tiny person who's bouncing on the trampoline of your fabric. So the dust itself will dust itself off of your fabric. So you usually have to go back and do it with something that won't do that, such as a pencil. I would not do a Sharpie or a marker because it will create too thick of a line. And you want to avoid that if at all possible, because if it's too thick, it'll bleed through the edge of your embroidery floss, whereas my embroidery floss is covering up my pencil design perfectly, so I don't have to worry about that. And I have my last leaf here. I'm glad I did a teeny tiny little flower. Otherwise, I would for sure not have enough time. I know when Maureen does her class, she does them for like 3 to 5 hours. And that's about as long as it takes me to do any kind of decent, basic sized embroidery and not a miniature like this. All right. Here is my daisy. The next stitch we're going to go over, and I'm not going to do it for every single flower petal because we probably won't have time for that, is this satin stitch. Satin stitch is a basic filling stitch. A big thing about satin stitch is do not do it for larger than 1 inch, or it will wiggle on itself and not do the pretty thing satin stitch is supposed to do, which is lay completely flat and feel with a satin texture. So whenever you're doing a circular shape like these petals, you start in the middle of the shape and you work out. So I'm going to start my satin stitch on the outside. I'm angling my needle so it's on the outside of that embroidery floss, and I'm pulling it taut, and then I'm angling it so it's hitting just on the outside of the other end of my petal, going straight across and pulling it taut, and I have my first satin stitch. Then on the same side that I just entered, I'm exiting on one side of that hole. I'm trying to be as close as I can without going back out the same hole. On some fabrics, that's easier than others, and then you go straight across and put your needle in right as close as you can to the other hole you did. You can even go inside that same hole since it's not next to you. And then again, right next to it, as close as I can. The satin stitch isn't laying as flat as I want it to. And then as close to that other hole as you can get it. And then that's how you're doing it, is you're just following that outside line of that outline you just did. So this backstitch outline we did won't actually be visible once this embroidery is complete. It'll all be covered up. So I've just finished that half of my petal. So I'm going to go back to the other side and do that other half. So I'm on that outside of the outline. Pull tight. And then I'm going on the other side of my outline and I'm pulling it tight as well. Coming back on. So this is where you really need to make sure you're pulling it tight when you come across so that it won't wiggle or move or anything, and will lay flat on that piece. So that's the real challenge with the satin stitch, is getting that tension just right and getting that spacing just right. Again, if you're doing over an inch, do not do a satin stitch. There's a couple other variations you can do. You can do a long and short stitch. You can do a couching stitch. And those are all excellent variations for how to cover a large area that you need filled, as opposed to satin stitch. Satin stitch is great for these smaller areas, like this petal that I'm doing. And even then, I don't know. It's a really good basic stitch to have. That is one petal in satin, and due to time constraints, if I have time, I'll come back and finish the rest of the petals during this stream. But I have 3 other stitches I want to show you so that you have a decent repertoire for when you go out and embroider on your own. So again, I'm going to finish off this variegated thread, and I go under a loop and then through the loop-de-loop, pull tight, under a stitch, through the loop-de-loop, pull tight, and last one, under a stitch, through the loop-de-loop, pull tight. And then I usually just do 3. You can do this. I would not do less than 3. I don't know how much more than 3 I would get, or you get a bunch where your knot is. The next one I want to show you is the chain stitch. The chain stitch is a really useful stitch, and it can be very pretty. It's a line stitch. You can use it to fill areas in. I have not, but I know Garnet used it to fill in the bottom half of a mermaid, to give it that scale effect, and it looked really pretty. So you can absolutely use it to fill in areas. Just know that the nature of the chain stitch leaves the middle of the stitch the empty, so you can see whatever fabric is underneath. Oftentimes when you're doing picture embroidery, that is undesirable. And if you enter it in a judging contest, they will knock you on that if they can see the fabric underneath through your embroidery. If you don't care about that, then go ahead and do a chain stitch as a filling stitch. It does not matter. Sweet, so I'm just knotting my thread. Got my needle all set up. to begin a chain stitch, again, I'm going to begin from the back of my embroidery and pull it so the knot hits the fabric. And I do one single stitch. And then just like the back stitch, I'm going to begin in front of that single stitch. But this time, instead of going back to it, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to wiggle it under that stitch. Just like that. And I'm going to pull it, and now I want this single stitch I did to be flat. So I'm going to take it from this end, and I'm just pulling the thread so that that stitch is taut. And I'm going to wrap it around and put my needle back in that exact same hole I just came out of and pull taut. And I don't want to pull it all the way tight like that. This one I do want to leave slightly open. It looks prettier that way because it's making a chain. And then I go one stitch length above that chain stitch, and I put my needle in between that chain stitch just like that, not catching any fabric. Leave it slightly loose, come around and go back in that exact same hole. Come back down and leave it slightly loose. Big thing with chain stitch is you want that tension to be consistent. So however loose you're leaving that first chain stitch is how loose you want to leave all your other chain stitches. Consistency is the most important thing in almost any craft I have ever seen. And that speaks for embroidery, for I know it speaks for tooling and leatherwork. Sewing to a point because you want to keep those straight lines, and I'm sure there's a whole lot of other crafts it speaks to. So I'm just going to follow this tiny little circle I drew, and I'm keeping that consistent. I'm going up one stitch length in front, pulling so that my back is flat. There's no loose ends on my back of my fabric. Looping under that chain stitch, pulling it, and going back in that exact same hole, pulling it to the same consistency. So I leave mine slightly loose, pull it, and I'm going all the way around this tiny little circle. What are we talking about? I use embroidery as fidgets. I have only embroidered on woven material. I know some people use embroidery. They will put the fabric on interfacing or on stabilizer to make sure that the fabric won't wiggle, and it'll be more like the embroidering on paper rather than on fabric. And then they can remove that stabilizer at the end. I have not tested that out. I don't know how that would work, but I know some people who do it. And what's the other thing? I know a lot of people, especially if you go to like fairs or anything that display embroidery projects, hand embroidery projects, they will do it on, I forgot what it's called, canvas. And you can do counted embroidery on canvas where you actually have to count how many holes in between you are going through to make sure it looks pretty. I have not done that. I always looked at that and went, that looks like a whole lot of work. But then I've also been working on a big giant embroidery project since January of this year, and I've probably racked up over 150 hours on that. So I don't know who I am to complain about something that looks like a whole lot of work. As you can see, even this tiny little embroidery patch I'm doing is taking a while. It's probably gonna go over the hour, so I'll get as much of this done that I can, and then finish it on my own time, I'm sure. But I will show you all of the stitches I was planning on showing you today. And And as soon as this thread's done, I'll switch and show you a different stitch. And this thread is almost out. I'll do one more stitch. There we go. Cool. I'm going to show you a different way you can finish your edge. Rather than doing the loop-de-loop and pull tight, you can do a loop-de-loop through several. So I'm going to weave through this thread, weave through this stitch, weave through this stitch, weave through this stitch. I'm going to do this 1 inch to 2 inches. And my thread, I'm going to snip it off just a little bit like that. And my thread's not going to come undone. It's going to take quite a bit for that thread to come undone. I will go ahead and switch now to a different stitch, even though my chain stitch isn't quite all the way done. And I'll come back to it if I need to, because I want to show you the running stitch and the French knot before I leave you. So the running stitch is a super basic stitch. If you've ever done any kind of hand sewing, you probably know the running stitch. So I need to split my thread. There we go. Thread my needle. Slip knot on the long end. Okay. And then I'm going to come up from underneath, and I'm going to start in the middle of one of my chain stitches. And then I'm going to pull it so my knot hits, and I'm going to loop over the tiny little section where my chains meet, and I'm going to pull it tight so it's flush with the fabric. And then I'm going to go forward 1 stitch length so it's in the other chain stitch. And then instead of going backwards like we've done every other stitch we've done, I'm just going to go forward again 1 stitch length. And then I put my needle forward 1 stitch length in front of that one. I did something wrong, but that's okay. And then I go forward 1 stitch length. Oops, and then my thread knotted in on itself. I find the easiest way to fix that is just to take your needle and then pull on the 2 sides, and it comes undone usually. And then you come and you go forward 1 stitch length with your needle, pull it flat, and then go forward 1 stitch length with your needle. So I'm just coming through, and this is called a running stitch. I'm doing it between my chain, but in which case it's called a chain running stitch. You don't have to. You can do it on the edge. A lot of people use running stitches as the outline stitch if they don't need as solid as an outline as you would for a back stitch. And it's just a super simple stitch where you go forward 1 back stitch, you go down, move your needle 1 stitch length, go up, forward 1 stitch length, down, move 1 stitch length, up, forward, down, forward, down, etc. And that would get you a running stitch that looks like that. I think it's pretty. I like the look of a chain stitch with a running stitch. I think it makes the chain just a little bit more prettier. Then I'm going to go ahead and knot this thread, even though I have quite a bit left of it. And I'm going to show you the last stitch I had planned for this lesson, which is a French knot. which is not usually something I would teach a brand new embroidery person, but everyone ought to have a knot in the basic embroidery repertoire, and I need something for the center of my flower. So French knot, you're going to come up wherever you want the knot to be, and you're going to pull your fabric tight, and I have a really hard time teaching the French knot with this setup. But you're going to hold your thread off to one side, and you're going to take your needle and you're going to go under your thread, and you're going to wrap it around your needle once, twice. I always do it 3 times. The more you wrap it, the bigger the knot's going to be. And then you're going to keep holding those wrappings tight on your needle, and you're going to go down in almost as close as you can to that exact same hole that you just went up with. And then while still keeping your thread tight, you're going to push your needle through and still keep the thread tight as it goes through, and then quickly release and pull it tight. And you have a French knot that looks like that. It is important, and then I'm going to fill the center of my flower with French knots. So I go up where I want it to be, pull it off. I pull it off to the left. It is important that you're doing it from the bottom of the thread and twisting around the bottom, because I find I have not been able to keep a knot in if I go from the top of my thread. Maybe you can. I don't know. I haven't been able to. So I'll do that again. I wish I could do it in slow motion for you guys. Where you want it, pull it off. I pull it to the left, but I'm also right-handed. So under your thread, wrap it once, twice, thrice. Keep it taut. Put your head of your top of your needle in where you need it to be, and pull it taut. And I'm getting a cute little pile of French knots right there. I know Mooring once used French knots and made clouds completely out of French knots, which would have taken absolutely forever, and is not something I want to replicate in my life, but who knows? Maybe I will. I wonder if I have enough thread to do all my French knots. Ooh, that'd be nice. I may not. It'll be close. Let's see. I think I have 2 French knots left. And the last French knot. Let's see if I have enough thread. I also need to leave enough thread so that I can knot my fabric. Haha. Yeah. I want one more. So if you don't keep your French knot tight enough, what happens is you get a loosey-goosey knot, which is, no, that one didn't even knot for me. Just because I tried to go down instead of holding my thread to keep it up. Blah, 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 blah. Try and go fast and it doesn't work. Of course not. Sweet. So now I have the center of my flower is full of cute little French knots, and I need to knot my fabric. Not my fabric, my thread. Not my thread. So I really like the pull through method to knot my thread. You can't always do it, so you do need to know the other way. But I find this way makes the back of my fabric, back of my embroidery less messy, keeps it a lot smoother, fancy things like that. Oh, ran out of thread. Snip that loose tail. So I'm not snipping super close, so it still doesn't just automatically unwaver. But that's the back of my embroidery. And this is the front so far with all French knots, all back stitch, satin stitch, chain stitch, and then the yellow running stitch in the middle. Those are the basic stitches I wanted to go over today. I can spend time finishing the rest Okay. I can either do that right now for the rest of the 20 minutes this class is scheduled for, or I can end the recording and do it on my own time. If anyone has embroidery questions, they can pop in now. I'll probably just end the recording.
I do believe it is completely up to you, Laeta, what you would like to do at this point.
I figured. As all you sin, I have to say, blah, blah. No, I'm not a man.
Before we end the recording, I would like to state that we are very thankful for Laeta for organizing all of the classes and sitting here and being in all of the classes and making sure whole two and making sure that they stayed on time and that they were recorded and I think that she deserves a hefty round of applause.
Yay! And thank you, Sin and Antoinette, for making the Discord happen, because I doubt my classes would have had half as much attendance if there wasn't a Discord channel set up to make people actually care about Chaos Wars. So, thank you for that.
And
darn it, I see
you to Len.
Yes, and thank you, Len, for doing the Twitch things, because,
Len and Alex for all the tech stuff and streaming stuff.
So true. So true.
We will also be uploading all of the streams to the new Chaos Wars YouTube channel. So we will link those when that gets done, which means we can then link those videos on the guild library page. So when that happens, I'll also be handling that whole stuff, and we'll let everyone know. And this run allows us to see, maybe next year at Chaos we can stream things, even if we're doing Chaos live. We'll have to figure it out, but maybe that means it's a possibility now.
If we have the tech things.
Don't give away secrets.
It's a free advertisement for next year.
Yeah, right. No, I know.